Hello everyone. In this video I will discuss one of the films called The 13th Floor, and never forget that I always pray for you and your family to be happy and healthy, always. A man drove his car to a place he had never even imagined going. After hours of a long journey, and not encountering any other forms of life, he began to break through a barricade and warning signs telling him to stop. Ignoring these warnings and venturing further, the man was shocked to discover the edge of his world was marked with rough metric lines, revealing that he had been living in a computer simulation all along. In 1937, in Los Angeles, an old man named Hannon Fuller was seen writing a letter he intended to show to a man named Douglas Hall. He then entrusted the letter to a trusted bartender named Aston, instructing him to keep the letter safe until someone named Douglas came to retrieve it. However, right after Fuller left, Aston secretly opened the letter and was quite shocked after reading its contents. Meanwhile, Fuller returned home and lay down next to his wife, but just as he closed his eyes, something happened that caused him to wake up in a computer lab in the middle of Los Angeles, set in the year 1997. This revealed that the world of 1937 he had just visited was merely a virtual reality simulation capable of providing a perfect experience of the past to anyone who visited it. Despite being a simulated world, all the characters within it were completely unaware that they were actually just computer programs. People from the real world could enter the simulation by transferring their consciousness into a desired character, and for a certain period, they could control that character and do whatever they wanted. In the next scene, Fuller, who had just woken up from the virtual world, carefully left his apartment and went to a bar. There he used a public phone in the bar to try to contact Douglas. However, at the same time, a mysterious man entered through the door, prompting Fuller to quickly follow him. Once outside the bar, the mysterious man suddenly stabbed Fuller with a knife, killing him on the spot. The scene then shifts to Douglas Hall, who wakes up from his sleep, shocked to find one of his clothes covered in blood. This leaves Douglas extremely confused as he cannot remember anything he did the previous night. At the same time, Douglas receives a call from a detective named McBain, who asks him to come to the police station immediately because Fuller, who turns out to be the boss at Douglas's workplace, was found brutally murdered that morning. Detective McBain, who is suspicious of Douglas, takes him to Fuller's house to look for clues. It is revealed that Douglas had a close relationship with Fuller, and they were working on a highly secretive project involving a virtual world simulation set in 1937. At Fuller's house, they are suddenly surprised by the appearance of a young woman named Jane, who claims to be Fuller's only child. She had just arrived from Paris after making an appointment with Fuller to meet at the house a few days earlier. However, when Jane arrived, she found out that Fuller had been reported murdered by an unknown person. Detective McBain immediately interrogates Jane to gather more information, while Douglas goes to the 13th floor, which turns out to be the computer lab where they are working on the virtual world simulation project set in 1937. There, Douglas meets his colleague Jason Whitney, who looks quite saddened by the news of their boss's death. Jason also reveals that Fuller had secretly tested the 1937 virtual simulation they were currently working on. This surprises Douglas because the simulation was not supposed to be tested for several more months. Afterward, Douglas returns home and listens to an audio message on his phone, once again shocked by a message from Fuller. Fuller claims to have discovered an incredible truth and has intentionally left a letter for Douglas within the 1937 virtual simulation, fearing that his own death was imminent. Following this message, Douglas hurries back to the computer lab and informs Jason about the message left by Fuller. He also analyzes all the characters Fuller encountered in the virtual world before expressing his desire to enter the simulation himself to find Fuller's letter. Jason initially opposes this idea as it could be very dangerous for Douglas, but after Douglas explains that all evidence of Fuller's murder now points to him and that he had moments where he couldn't remember his actions, Jason finally decides to help Douglas, but only for a period of 2 hours. Soon after, Jason transfers Douglas's consciousness into a character named John Ferguson, a bank employee in the 1937 virtual world. Initially, Douglas, now controlling Ferguson's character, appears quite confused and tries to process everything that is happening. He is also quite astonished by the accurate representation of the city, which makes him smile for a moment. After taking a break, Douglas goes to meet Grierson, a historian whose character Fuller had previously used to visit this world. During their conversation, Douglas is shocked by Grierson's admission that he has no recollection of ever writing any letter to him. This reveals that once someone exits the simulation, the character they used immediately forgets the events that occurred and struggles to remember what they did while under control. Unsuccessful with Grierson, Douglas then meets another character who directs him to a bartender named Cherry Aston, who works at the Wilshire Grand Hotel. Surprisingly, Douglas notices that Aston bears a striking resemblance to Jason. Douglas asks Aston if Fuller ever left a message for him, but Aston pretends not to know and denies ever receiving any message. This seems to be because Aston had read the letter Fuller left about the truth of their world. At the same time, Douglas suddenly feels something strange in his body. He quickly goes to the restroom, suffers a seizure, and then Ferguson's body collapses unconscious, bringing Douglas back to the real world in the computer lab in 1997. This was caused by Jason deliberately pulling Douglas's consciousness back because the memory link between Douglas and Ferguson was beginning to overlap. If Jason hadn't acted quickly, Douglas's consciousness could have been permanently trapped in Ferguson's character. Despite this, Douglas, with a wide smile, eagerly shares his experience with Jason, claiming that the virtual world they created works remarkably well. Meanwhile, in the 1937 simulation, Aston starts to realize something is wrong with his world after the person previously claiming to be Douglas openly states his name is John Ferguson, unable to remember how he ended up there. Back in the real world in 1997, a bartender from the bar where Fuller was murdered, named Tom Jones, comes to the computer lab office, requesting to speak privately with Douglas. During their conversation, Tom reveals that the person who killed Fuller was none other than Douglas himself, as he witnessed the crime firsthand. Tom then demands a large sum of money from Douglas to keep quiet and not report this to the police. Naturally, Douglas is quite confused because he has no memory of killing Fuller. Douglas just remained silent and fought, which caused Tom to decide to run away and threaten him. Seemingly forgetting the incident, Douglas then invites Jane to dinner to talk about the message Fuller left him. It becomes clear that they are starting to like each other. Jane suggests that Douglas should distance himself from all these problems before he ends up like her father. Douglas thanks her for her concern, and the two begin to dance, leading to a deeper relationship. After the romantic dinner, Douglas is startled while sleeping at home by several security officers who arrest him and take him to the police station on charges of murdering Tom Jones. Detective McBain reveals that Tom had previously come to the police station to state that he saw Fuller leave with Douglas on the night he was killed. Fortunately, the next morning, Jane arrives at the police station and frees Douglas from the murder charges. Jane has bail and strong evidence showing that Douglas was with her the night Tom was killed. Despite Jane's certainty of Douglas's innocence, Douglas himself feels that just because he can't remember anything doesn't mean he isn't the perpetrator. So Douglas hurries back to the computer lab to once again transfer his consciousness into the character John Ferguson in the virtual world to seek answers. He goes to see Grierson again and initially faces rejection because it is late at night. However, after Douglas promises to reveal why Grierson sometimes wakes up in unknown places, Grierson agrees. They then go to the Wilshire Grand Hotel, where Grierson reveals that over the past 3 days, he has experienced strange memory flashes of himself frequently going to this hotel for no apparent reason. Hearing this, Douglas becomes quite excited and presses Grierson to remember if he ever gave a letter or note to anyone. Luckily, it doesn't take long for Grierson to recall that he did give a letter to a bartender named Aston. But just before Douglas heads to the counter, he sees Aston fleeing, so Douglas chases him to the basement. Unfortunately, Aston has a gun ready and demands that Douglas explain what is really happening in this world. Aston had noticed that Douglas had switched bodies with Ferguson, and the letter left by Fuller made him realize that everything around them isn't real. Aston knows this because he is the one who discovered the edge of the world, marked with rough metric lines, proving that this world is just a computer simulation. This fact, of course, leaves Douglas confused about why Fuller wrote a letter about the boundaries of the simulation to him, as Douglas already knew this. Before Douglas can say anything, Aston threatens to kill him for messing with people's minds and tries to drown Douglas in a pool. Fortunately, Jason arrives just in time to save Douglas's real body, which was having seizures. This incident shakes Douglas, leading him to declare that the 1937 simulation project is a mistake, and he decides to shut it down, much to Jason's disappointment. Douglas then goes to meet Jane at the hotel, but finds that she has checked out. Detective McBain, who also came to meet Jane, approaches Douglas and reveals something shocking. In his investigation, he discovered that Fuller never had a daughter, and that no woman named Jane Fuller has ever lived in America or Paris. This revelation makes it quite confusing as to who Jane Fuller really is. After a while, Douglas bribes a hotel driver to get the last known address of the woman claiming to be Jane Fuller. At this location, Douglas is directed to a supermarket where he meets a cashier named Natasha Molinaro, who looks very similar to Jane Fuller. Although Natasha claims she doesn't know Douglas or Hannon Fuller's company, she feels a strange connection with Douglas. Eventually, Douglas realizes that the Los Angeles of 1997, which he considered the real world, is actually another computer simulation. This becomes evident when Douglas decides to go to a place he would never think of visiting, and finds the edge of the world marked with the rough metric lines of a computer simulation. The letter Fuller left in the 1937 simulation was actually to explain to Douglas that the world they have been living in is also a virtual reality. Meanwhile, Detective McBain, who arrives at Natasha's supermarket, begins confronting her about Jane Fuller's identity. However, since Natasha cannot remember or understand what he is saying, McBain realizes that something is wrong with this world and decides to investigate further. Sometime later, Jane Fuller re-enters Natasha's body and contacts Douglas, arranging a meeting at Fuller's office. There, Jane explains that there are actually thousands of simulated worlds, but the 1997 world is the only simulation capable of creating its own simulations. Hence, the 1937 world created by Fuller and Douglas cannot connect with other simulated worlds. According to Jane, the real world is currently in the year 2024, where she is indeed Fuller's biological daughter. Jane further reveals that it was actually Douglas who killed Fuller in this world, but the act was not entirely Douglas's fault because his character was controlled by David, Jane's real-life husband, in 2024. Initially, David was a very good man when they first met, but over time, something changed. David began using the simulated worlds as a playground to kill people for his own amusement. Meanwhile, in the computer lab on the 13th floor, a curious Jason uses the device to transfer his consciousness into Aston's body in the 1937 virtual world. Unfortunately, Jason is killed there after being hit by a car, inadvertently causing Aston's consciousness from the 1937 virtual world to transfer into Jason's body in 1997. Aston, finding himself in a more futuristic environment, is fascinated. His strange behavior prompts a security guard to report him to Douglas, who is currently in bed with Jane. Douglas quickly goes to the computer lab to talk to Jason, but it doesn't take long for him to realize that he is not speaking to Jason, but to Aston's consciousness in Jason's body. Douglas tries to engage in a normal conversation, but Aston soon pulls a gun and pressures Douglas to answer his questions. With no other choice, Douglas reveals that they are not in the real world, but inside a simulated world programmed using computer devices. To convince him, Douglas takes Aston to the 13th floor, where all the virtual worlds and their contents are created. Initially confused, Aston slowly starts to appreciate the place and even lowers his gun to take in the fresh air. However, at the same time, David from 2024 takes over Douglas's consciousness and immediately kills Aston. He then finds Jane in Douglas's apartment. Feeling jealous, David attempts to kill her, but before he can do anything, Detective McBain suddenly appears and shoots David dead. It seems the detective is also starting to realize they are in a computer simulation. Before parting, Detective McBain asks Jane not to interfere with their characters once she returns to the real world. The scene then shifts to the real world in 2024. David's death in the 1997 simulation causes Douglas's consciousness to transfer into David's real body in 2024. Douglas is quite surprised when he wakes up in a large house and eventually meets the real Jane. Jane then takes Douglas to a balcony to show him the view of the technologically advanced world of 2024. The surprise doesn't end there, as the 2024 version of Fuller is still alive and in good health. The film ends with the 2024 real world shrinking into digital image lines, implying that the 2024 world is also another simulation. And that's it for the story series of this film. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to support this channel by subscribe, like and share. See you in the next video. Goodbye.